Basketball elbows.
Welcome to Shit That Therapists Say. We polled our Mended Light fan community for what are some things that therapists have said to them, because not all therapists are great, and even great therapists have terrible, terrible lapses in judgment. So what is
These things happen.
These things do happen. What's our question today? Or not our question. What's our...
Supposition?
Yeah, what's our supposition today? What has the therapist said?
All men are addicted to porn.
Really?
Okay, so someone's therapist told them that, all men. So I'm assuming this was the person was saying, my husband's addicted to porn and I want help, and the therapist is like, all men are addicted to porn.
Not a big deal.
Yeah, not a big deal. All men. Okay, what are your thoughts on that? I'll share mine.
First off, I think we need to talk about where porn fits in a healthy relationship, or deciding whether or not porn fits.
Well, for some couples, they consider it a healthy part of this balanced breakfast, right? For them, it's this is how we get our sex life going. This is where we get ideas. We watch it together. We get aroused. For other people, it's a moral issue. You're looking at somebody other than me in a sexual way, or you're entertaining fantasies about somebody else, and it's not a shared value. So the research does show that porn is detrimental, broadly speaking, to relationships. The Gottmans discovered this. Their theory was that it wasn't, and then the research showed that it was. It's especially detrimental when there at least one person in the marriage has the value that porn is bad.
Or the partnership.
Or the partnership, because then, it's something that they're going outside of your values. But there's lots of reasons why you would want to be careful with porn. But there are people who consume it, and they report it brings them together.
So basically deciding what fits in your moral paradigm.
Right.
And if you would like to know the research-based data on it, Google the Gottmans and the study they did.
Correct. And let's talk about whether you can actually be addicted to porn and what that even means. So first of all, I don't think you could say all men or all women.
No.
Anything.
Well, and I think to make porn a predominantly male subject is a little bit of sexism, right?
Yeah.
There are plenty of women that struggle with pornography and don't want to.
Right.
And so talking about it like it's a male issue when really it's just a human need issue.
And there are plenty of women who consume pornography and are quite content with that. They consume pornography. But yes, it's definitely not a male issue. I think of Obi-Wan Kenobi. Only a Sith deals in absolutes. I know how much you love Star Wars. But I would, as a therapist, I would look at that and say, can you as a clinician say that about an entire gender, that all men do anything or all women do anything? So first of all, that statement is null and void, but let's talk about what addiction is. What do you see addiction being? Addiction
would be anything that's creating such an imbalance in your life that it's disrupting healthy, normal behaviors.
Yeah. Yep. Where people say, well, is it addiction or is it compulsion? And they're actually very close to being pretty much the same thing. Some people will argue that you can't be addicted to something that's not a substance, right? You can be addicted to alcohol or to drugs, but you can't be addicted to gambling or to pornography or to video games because that's not a substance. But the fact is, it's all biochemistry. It's all the brain releasing dopamine.
Right.
Trigger pleasure to say, do this again, do this again, do this again. It's like the rat pressing the button to get the cheese, right? Every single time.
I think I'm addicted to it.
And you talk about interfering with daily functioning.
It lights up that pleasure center in the brain, the amygdala, right?
Yeah.
And so every time that you go to get that release or that rush of happy hormones, what happens? Like, is it the same high every single time?
No, and that's something called tolerance comes in, where you need to get more or do something more extreme to get the same buzz that you used to get. And that is definitely true of pornography. People will start with sex scenes in movies or TV shows, and they get into softcore, and then they get into hardcore. And for some people, that's where it stops. But for a lot of people, they get into some really deviant stuff. I mean, people who get into child pornography don't usually start there, right? People who get into bestiality don't usually start there. They're chasing that buzz. That the tolerance psychologically is, what used to do it for me isn't doing it for me anymore, so now I got to chase more, right? And that's part of the addictive nature of pornography. It's addictive because you talked about how it impedes your daily living. Any sort of addiction is going to get in the way of completing your work. It's going to get in the way of your relationships. It's going to cause financial problems as you start to spend money on your addiction and start to disregard other financial obligations. And it's going to start to become something that your entire life is about. There's lying, there's deceit, right? There's all sorts of things that are wrapped up in these addictive behaviors to where if I had to sum up what addiction is you lose yourself.
Yeah. That you're no longer the driver.
Yes.
But you'll lose yourself.
And I've talked to people who they would be consuming porn while at work, right? Or they would be doing they'd be talking with a family member on the phone while watching porn. Like they couldn't separate it. Like their life became consumed by it.
Well, and we've done a couple videos on the subject of pornography. So we're not going to talk about everything here, but we have previously talked about the shame and the judgment and the guilt.
Yes.
That almost always surrounds the conversation of pornography. Because if you've grown up in a primarily religious culture, it's something that's not accepted.
Right.
And so if you're looking at your life and you're saying, okay, this is a struggle I have and that I don't want to have. Because we're not here to pass judgment on here's what you should or shouldn't be doing. The question to ask yourself, is this serving me? Is this something I want in my life?
Right.
And if the answer is no, the first step is to work through that judgment, that shame, and that guilt so you aren't alone.
Yeah, well, we have two extremes, right? One is porn is evil, and so if you consume it, you are evil.
Right.
Or, you've lost the light that's in you. And the other extreme is what this therapist said, that all men are addicted to porn. In other words, everybody's doing it. It's not a big deal, right?
Or boys will be boys.
Or boys will be boys. And the healthy medium is asking yourself, okay, does this serve me? Is this something that I want to have in my life, number one? Number two, we don't need to over-normalize it by saying everyone's addicted to it. But the fact is, it's everywhere. And you've said to me before, it's not a question of if someone is exposed to pornography, but when, right? And how deeply entrenched do they get in it. But the idea that someone can go their entire life without seeing it is, anytime anyone says to me, I've never looked at porn, I'm like, have you looked at anything that was designed to sexually arouse you? Because that's the definition of porn. Right? And so stripping away the judgment from it is, I'm not an evil person because I've looked at this. I'm not an evil person because I've consumed this, but is this aligned with my values? In my personal case, I had a porn habit that was very hard for me to break. And part of the reason why it was hard to break was because of the shame. That oftentimes the shame is meant to break the behavior. Like if you feel bad enough, you'll stop it. But it actually feeds the...
Shame never does that.
It never does that. It feeds the compulsion. I would feel terrible about myself. And to make that feeling go away, I consumed porn because it gave me that little buzz. And then I feel terrible about myself. And then I consumed porn and round and round we would go. I had to get to a place where I just asked myself, okay, I'm still a good man. I'm still a good person. Am I living in alignment with who I want to be by consuming this? And the answer for me was no. And so for me, that was the biggest step in being able to actually break the cycle, is recognizing this isn't something I want in my life, but that doesn't mean I'm terrible if I slip up.
Changed man.
And if you want to hear Jono talk about his breakup story with porn, you can check out that video on this channel.
Breaking up is hard to do. I dumped porn, and it was an ugly breakup, but it had to happen. Well,
and going back to what you were saying about everybody is exposed to it, right? Because everybody's, like, we live in a sexualized world. And I think that leads to the conversation of how do we talk about it? Healthy sexuality. Like,
right.
So often healthy sexuality is not modeled.
No.
It so often it's in extremes, especially in predominantly religious cultures. And so how do we have those healthy conversations with our children? And when do we start?
Well, because the fact is we're sexual beings and we're sexually curious. And in cultures where you can't talk about sex or where there are no healthy models, what happens is either a vacuum of knowledge on the subject, or I could go to porn and learn about it because that's where sex is happening, right? Sex is happening. I think how we talk about it is by normalizing it. See, for me, I grew up in a religious culture, but sex was never shameful in and of itself.
There was very healthy conversations around healthy sexuality.
Yeah,
which I would say is quite the minority.
It is, sadly. But I mean, my dad, he used, and I know you do this with our kids, he used the real names for the various body parts, and he was very straightforward about just the kind of the science of it. And then as I grew older, we talked about, the ethical implications of it, right? Of who and when and where and how you show respect and things like that. And and when to show self-control and, when to enjoy the experience. And even though my dad shared his values with me, it was very much an ongoing conversation where to me, sex was never something shameful or that couldn't be talked about or something dirty or bad. It was something beautiful, right? And in my family, the value was to reserve that for a serious committed relationship, to reserve that for a close connection of trust, to not cheapen it. Was the language. Now, to some people, that's condescending. For some people, casual sex is part of their paradigm, and you dare call my casual sex cheap. Okay. But even casual sex can be practiced respectfully. Even casual sex can be about connection and can be about not objectifying, not taking advantage, where there's mutual consent and mutual respect.
Well, and you had conversations with your dad through your teens and into your 20s.
Yeah.
Like even as an adult, before you were in a committed relationship where you had sex, of is this appropriate,
And when it came to that, so when I finally made the transition, oh my gosh, when I finally made the transition out of perpetual virginity to, as you do, it was like before, if I'm kissing or making out, there's a certain point where, okay, now we're going to stop. And now it's completely natural and now we don't have to stop, right? It was never, oh gosh, how do we do this, right? Because sex was always healthy and beautiful. And in my family, porn was framed as, porn isn't about connection. Porn isn't about respect. Mm-hmm. Porn isn't about a beautiful, meaningful moment, which I know that there is a shift in the culture now towards a healthier erotica because so much porn is misogynistic, so much porn is based on the male gaze, so much porn is based on relationships that are degrading or condescending or, flippant. I think morally speaking, I'm less concerned about relationship-based erotica than I am about porn for that reason.
Going back a little bit, you talked about as the child what that conversation looked like with your parent and through the years. And I'd like to talk a little bit about from the other perspective as the parents with our kids, what has that conversation looked like?
Yeah.
And I think it is just a very natural conversation. I started having these conversations with my oldest son when he was still young, even before you were a part of our lives, because I recognized, when his dad and I divorced and separated, statistically speaking, children of divorced parents have a higher chance of being abused just because of their life circumstances.
Yeah.
And not that I thought, well, then that means something's going to happen to my son, but it was a very high level of awareness, right? I'm going to assume that all of my children are going to be exposed to pornography, and I'm going to take the chance of them potentially being abused or molested or something like that very high. And so I started having these conversations. It depends on the child, but about the time they're 2 and 3 years old. And it's just about safe parts of your body, right?
Yeah.
And teaching them how to clean themselves. And then where they clean themselves, saying, now this is a safe part of your body and other people don't touch this part of your body.
Yeah.
Right? And so having those healthy body conversations and then doing it with the actual words, right? And not nicknames, right? And then continuing that conversation on. And so my son was 6 years old when he was at a sleepover with cousins who were also 6 and 7 years old.
Yeah.
And one of his cousins went and got one of their parents' phones and started playing hardcore, like, sex videos on YouTube.
Wow.
And I was unaware that this had happened a couple times before, right? Because the shame and the judgment. No
one wants to tell their parents because then their parents are going to get mad and they're going to...
Well, no, like the adult parents didn't want to tell their siblings like that this had happened, right? Previously. So this wasn't the first time this had happened at a sleepover with cousins. This was the first time this happened at a sleepover where my child was there. And so that's how I became aware of it. But at 6 years old, he knew enough that this isn't right. And he was the one that told the parents in the morning, right? And then it became a big conversation. But the reality of the world we live in, with every child carrying around devices that can access almost anything, it's not a matter of if a child gets exposed to pornography, but when, and then what are they going to do about that, right? And so continuing those healthy conversations with our kids, I think, is the best thing that we can do to support them, because they don't have the full frontal lobe, right? Which is our logical thinking brain. It's not fully developed till they're in their 20s. And that's why underage drinking, underage smoking is so serious, is because those neural pathways get formed at such an impressionable age, and it's so much harder to break away from them when they're older.
Right. If you get into anything as an adolescent, you're more likely to be addicted than if you get into it as an adult. Which is why there are laws for drugs, alcohol, and pornography, because if you get into them as an adult, can they still harm you? Yes, but they're less likely to be addictive or to form your worldview than if you consume them when you're younger.
You're a bad influence.
Yeah, and continuing that conversation, that same son who's now 15, we just had a conversation last week about healthy sexuality.
Yeah.
And having those connections, having those abilities to have those healthy conversations make all the difference. I had a dear friend who it was a part of his life for decades, and he didn't want it to be, but he was exposed at a young age, and he had a conversation with me, and he said, I just want to let you know that this is something that's no longer a part of my life.
And one thing I love that you ask our kids when it comes to anything is this who you want to be? Right. And I want to create a situation, I think, that we have where they can come to us and know that we're not going to shame them. In fact, I've had, our son told me that he accidentally watched something and that he turned it off, but he told me about it. And I was very pleased that he did, because that said to me, he knows I'm not going to get mad at him or shame him.
Right.
And then we talked about what he's going to do next time that happens. What type of person do you want to be is such a better question than why did you do that, or how could you let this happen, or all these other things. So,
well, and you can ask yourself that, right? Because we all, just because we're adults, we all still have struggles, right? And so you asked basically yourself that question of what type of person do I want to be? And you said this doesn't fit the paradigm.
Yeah.
And setting that example for our children. And I think another important thing to note in this conversation regarding addiction, whatever the addiction might be, is the cure to addiction isn't abstinence. The addiction is there because you're trying to fill a void, right? The cure to addiction is connection. And so how can we create that connection in our own lives and with the people we care about?
Nailed it. She nailed it. We want to thank you for joining us for Shit Therapists Say. Have you had an experience with a therapist where they told you something that made you go, Sound off in the comments below. What do you do about pornography and its influence in your life and home? Sound off in the comments below. We want to invite you to check out this other video. Just go with it, they said, right here. As always, like, subscribe, click the bell so you get notifications every time we have a new video.
Yay!
And until next time, keep shining, because we need your light. Oh, here it comes. We said it was coming, and it's coming. The video is here for you to watch right